So this morning we're going to talk about either worshiping versus worrying. You're either a worship. I'll say that maybe a little bit differently, a little bit better. You in worship, you're either a warrior or you're a worrier. Okay? So we're going to look at some worship, some stories of worship where there's either warriors or worriers. You can catch my little play on words there. I know you're not dumb, but I'm just trying to help you out. Okay? So, let's turn to Exodus 33. I'm not going to take long. We've talked about worship for a whole month, and there's probably many more things that we can talk about. But I just want to, I just kind of want to leave us with this one, I think. Okay? If you have your Bible open, Exodus 33. We're going to look at a little bit of Moses. Okay, now let me set up Exodus 32 and before. Exodus 32, we know Moses was on Mount Sinai with God. And he received what from God when he was on the mountain? Received the Ten Commandments. Alright? So he had already been up on the mountain. He had already been in God's presence. He was up spending time with God, taking time with God, and getting word from God, receiving a word from God. Amen? Now, what were the people who were not with Moses doing? Sorry? Building an idol. Right? We get in Exodus 32. They're building an idol. They think Moses is taking too much time. Well, isn't that a church sentence right there? We're just taking too much time in worship. He's just spending way too much time in God's presence. Can we go ahead and get along with it? We got a schedule to keep, right? We got to get people in and out of here. Everybody's getting real uncomfortable already. We got to get people in and out of here. We can keep them longer than that. We can't keep them longer than this. Anything they don't have that much of an attention span. I like to give you people credit and think you have an attention span. So that's why I don't mind preaching longer than 15 minutes. I think you can handle some of it. So, while Moses is taking time in worship, the people are getting impatient. And they say, well, let's just, we don't really know what he's doing up there, and he's taking too much time. So let's just go ahead and do our own thing. And they get into idol worship. They build a golden calf, and it's just a mess. Moses comes down, and what does he hear? But people singing, but not singing praise to God. And he comes down, and he's frustrated. What does Moses do with the Ten Commandments? He throws them down, and they break. And it's just a sad picture. Now let's look at Exodus 33. Exodus 33, in the first few verses, God says, Moses, you need to depart from these here, and you need to go up and get out of the land of Egypt. You need to go to the land which I promised you. Right? And Moses, in verse 7, Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. So it was whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass. I'm just asking you, but do you guys see that? Do you see that while one man was making the journey to go to God's presence, everybody else around was honoring and respecting the fact of what he was doing? Right? In our day, there's not much of that. There's not much of that because While one person right next to you could be trying to, listen to me for a second. While one person right next to you could be worshiping with all their heart, they could be clinging to God's word. Maybe it is with their last breath. They are really trying. They need something from God. They're desperate. And the person next to them has no consideration. The next person next to them could be playing on their phone. The next person next to them could be saying, well, I wish this would hurry up in this song so that we can move along. Maybe that person next to them is getting ready to push to the place where everyone else wants to go but can't. Because they're too worried about the time and not enough honoring of what they're doing. Listen, I'm not trying to condemn you here this morning, because I want to move on from this, I promise. But when we come here, right, and I'm not just talking about myself, but when we come here, we prepare a message, we prepare songs, we prepare the atmosphere, we prepare the heat, we prepare the lights, we prepare everything so that we may come in here and worship. Amen? That's just the physical aspect. So all we ask is that you honor that. We have prepared it for you to honor that. Right? If you're going to get up and if you're going to come here, then why don't you honor it and give God glory, give Him worship while you're here. Who cares if we take 5 minutes extra? Who cares if we take 5 minutes short? Who cares if we turn the lights on and off? None of that really matters. The point of it is for us. If you're not going to do anything, at least honor the person next to you who's doing it. Because if anything in these stories we will point out is that usually the worshiper was in the minority. I'll move on. Sorry, that was in 9 in my notes. Verse 9. Came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man in his tent door. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. He gets in this, comes down from the mount. Everybody's in false worship, idol worship. He goes off the spout. He just loses his temper. And then he goes back and meets with the Lord, and he continues to do so. He continues to worship. He continues to get into God's presence. And then he goes on to say, he goes to God and he says, God, you told me to bring these people out of here, but I'm going to tell you, I'm not going unless you're going with us. And this is where it says this. In verse 18, Moses asked God, what? Show me your glory. I just thought it was kind of neat that while the whole lot of people were in false worship, were worried about the time, there was one man in both instances, before and after Moses, who kept going back to the presence of God. We might never have got this verse, this story of God, show me your glory, if it had not been for the people attacking God in their false worship. Let me give you another example. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Second Samuel chapter 6, you can kind of go down and look at verse 16. 2 Samuel chapter 6, 16, but I'll kind of set the story up. One is, David is trying to restore the ark into the house of God. Right, are you with me? It has been taken away, and he says, we gotta get it back. And they go and get it. And remember, they're they're carrying it, and that's when it began to fall, and Uzzah puts his hands against it, and he's trying to stop it, but then God strikes him dead for touching it, because, well, I won't even get into all that right now. All right? Most of you know why, and if you're not, I'll talk to you later about it. We get down, and then he finds out, man, we can't be doing this, so they put it at Obed-Edom's house. Right? I'm sure Obed-Edom loved that. Oh, killed a guy, thanks for bringing it here. But really, Obed-Edom Obed-Edom honored it, and he was blessed because of it. And then David finds out that Obed-Edom is being blessed, and his house is being blessed because he is honoring the ark. And verse 12, David finds out about it. So they said, we got to go back and we got to go and we got to bring this back. But this time they carry it differently. They carry it properly. Okay, which was the whole purpose of why Uzzah was struck dead, because they weren't handling it properly. So then it happens to this. Verse 13. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And so it was when those bearing the Ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. 6 paces. Every 6 paces they were sacrificing. Verse 14. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. David was worshiping. He was praising. He was dancing. Right? Why was he doing so? Because they're bringing the presence of God back to the house of God. They're bringing God in his presence. They're bringing the ark, which represented all of that. God's life, God's presence. And they're bringing it back into the tabernacle. And he's restoring worship in the house of God. And he is praising. And David, the king, basically, out in front of everyone, he's dancing like a lunatic. But you know usually what happens when someone goes way overboard with the worship? What? Is that someone also usually attacks it. They're worried about it. Right? Look here. Verse 16. Now, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, or however you pronounce it, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord. Yay! Woo! Could you imagine that? No wonder you get the term holy rollers when people were flipping around like that. See, God created gymnastics, but he created it for his glory. He didn't create it for a gold medal. David, leaping, twirling. They're shouting, they're blasting trumpets. And she despised him in her heart. So they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it, that David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Do you imagine that? Let me ask you a question just to think about. Let me ask you, how long do you think that took? Okay. Then he distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. Then David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. Now, it keeps calling Michal the daughter of Saul. Do you know who else Michal was? David's wife. This is the woman that he got and was married because he was honoring Saul. When David said, I promise you my wife. Or when Saul said, I promise you my daughter. I'll give you my daughter as your wife. So he gets Michal. And this is what happens. The daughter of Saul, his wife, came out to meet David and said, with a tad bit of sarcasm, how glorious was the king of Israel today. offering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. So basically she's criticizing him because he was just down into his linens. He was down in his little linen robe. He wasn't wearing his kingly garments. He wasn't wearing nothing nice. He was wearing something that usually only people close to him would see him in. Yet he's doing it down the street, dancing, leaping, and whirling, because he found no honor in himself, but only in that the ark of the Lord was coming back. So David says to Michal, it was before the Lord. Basically saying, I didn't care who was around me and who saw. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for you. It wasn't even for myself. It was before God that I danced. Man, I wish we could come into church that way. How often we worry about what someone else might think, or if we might disrupt them, or if we might... This is the house of God. This is what it was built for. It was built for prayer. It was built for worship. It was built for God's time, God's presence. And he says, but it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, or over the people of the Lord over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. That was where he was worshiping. Was in his humility. In the fact that he cared not what anyone else thought about the warriors. He was trying to be a warrior in his worship. Let me give you another example. Luke chapter 10. Are you staying with me? Is that all right? Luke chapter 10. We've talked about many of these stories over the past month, but I'm just kind of giving you them one more time as a refresher and as a reminder. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. Mary and Martha, the story of Mary and Martha. This is a short one. It happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. So Martha welcomes Jesus into her home. Yet Mary is the one hanging out with Jesus, sitting at his feet, worshiping, hearing his word. But Martha, verse 40, was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, look at this. You are worried and troubled about many things. Basically saying, you are worried about everybody else in this room. You are worried about your sister, but you are in all caring about that. But see, the one thing that you need to be caring about, that's what Mary's doing. Mary has chosen the one thing that is needed, and that is to spend time in my presence while I'm here. He says, one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her. How many of us come into church and come into God's presence and says, it does not matter what happens, worship will not be taken away from me this morning. God, nothing, I don't care if everyone else in the room is a wet blanket. I don't care if my phone rings when I'm at home. I don't care what happens. I don't care if I'm getting Facebook messages and my phone's ringing, or if there's something to show on TV. There is not one thing that's going to take me away from worship. Luke chapter 7. Flip quickly. I'm almost done. Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. Jesus in the story again. Verse 36, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him. Asked him to come to his house. Again, just like Martha. Hey, you come to my house. So he went to the Pharisee's house, sat down to eat. Behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and stood at his feet behind him weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. She kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Now, we've talked about how lowly it is and how you come and fall down before Jesus when you worship, and basically the position of worship, the posture of worship. So we're not going to talk about this morning. So she comes in and she's doing all this lavishing things on Jesus, weeping, kneeling, wiping her tears on his feet with her hair. And Simon, again, the attacker, stands off and says, Jesus didn't even know what kind of woman this is touching him. See, someone almost always will have a problem with extravagant worship. If your neighbor doesn't have a problem with you, then there's probably a problem. Or if you have a problem with your neighbor, then maybe you're the one. But there's usually one who will go overboard, and then one or so or more who will attack said person to be going overboard. Let's keep going. Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. So he said, Teacher, say it. There's a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, You have rightly judged. Then he turned to the woman and said, Simon, do you see this woman? Now this is where it gets really good. I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, which was a custom, which was the least of what he should have done. But she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. She went overboard. You gave me no kiss, which was how they greeted one another, with a brotherly kiss. Simon did not. This woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. She went overboard. You did not anoint my head with oil, which was the custom, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. She went overboard. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, and the same loves little. Then he said to her, Your sins are forgiven. Two perfect examples. If it doesn't matter what state you're in, but it doesn't matter how you worship and how you are viewed in worship. Now, I have one more example. Some people think this story, the sinner woman and Simon, is one story. And then the other story of the other woman pouring oil is another woman. And I'm not going to dispute that. But there are also people who believe that they could be the same story. If you look in Matthew, Mark, and John, you basically have one account. And then Luke's account is completely different. If you look at Matthew, Mark, John's version, they all, I think they do, name the woman Mary. Luke does not name her. Luke talks about her in her poor character. However, Matthew, Mark, and John knew Mary. So if it was the same woman, they're not going to really criticize her character to begin with. They want to name her because they know and love Mary. One, his name is Simon as well, which was also a popular name, as was Mary, a very popular name. Simon, in one account, is a leper. Simon, in this account, Luke chapter 7, is a Pharisee. Could this Simon the Pharisee have been a leper? And while he sits there with leprosy, judging the woman who is a prostitute? I really don't know. I wish I knew the answer. And really, it doesn't matter if it's two accounts, one account. The point of the story is that one woman, willing to go way overboard, received criticism. In this account, it is Simon the Pharisee who is thinking to himself, I can't believe Jesus is letting this woman touch him. In the other accounts, it's the disciples who say, Jesus, man, she just wasted a bunch of oil. We could have used that for money. Could have sold it. Put it in our treasury. Let's look at Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26, it's also in Mark 14, it's also in John 12. Matthew 26, verse 6. When Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil. And she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor." Why this waste? Why go to the extreme and go overboard when we could do something better with it? Why go to the extreme in worship and take 45 minutes when we could take 45 minutes and do something better with our time? Why go to the extreme and play loud and dance and shout when we could use that energy to go outside and feed the poor? Listen to me. He's not saying that we go and have a party. The disciples said, we could use this money to feed the poor, which Jesus cared very greatly about feeding the poor, right? Are you still with me? I'm closing, I promise. My first and final closing. We could better our time by feeding the poor. We could use this money and not waste it. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? Why are you attacking the one person who is willing to worship?" Now, understand me. I'm not putting down feeding the poor. I'm not saying we quit feeding the poor. I am saying worship to God is more valuable than any work that we could do. The government feeds the poor. I wonder how much worship God gets from that. bands all over the world will prepare songs, will sing to make people feel better. I wonder how much worship God gains from it. People gather in churches all over the nation. And I wonder how much worship God gets from a crowded group of people who can't wait to get out. He said, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me." For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. This one thing that this woman does is the one thing that makes her legacy live forever. I'm going to ask Steve and Mike, Aaron, if you guys all don't mind to come up and prepare some music. Let me say this. We've learned over the past few weeks that worship is sacrifice, that it's an offering, that it's giving. We learned also that it has to be extravagant. It's always extravagant. It doesn't matter if it's someone dancing, playing instruments, pouring oil. No matter what it was always extravagant. Obviously, we know extravagant has the word extra in it, which means you go overboard. Your worship is an extravagant, sacrificial offering to God. That alone will usually upset people. Now, the goal is not to upset people. The goal is not to shake your tambourine because you know your neighbor hates it. Because that's not an attitude of worship either. Well, I don't care if they like it or not. I'm just going to stand over closer to them and shake my tambourine. That's not the goal. The goal is not to upset people. The whole goal is to forget that anybody else is even around. The goal is to give God the glory that He's worthy of. See, glory, in a simple form, glory means weight. W-E-I-G-H-T. And I want to talk about that in a whole other sermon, but basically what we do is we give too many people too much weight. And we don't come in the house of God and give God all the weight. We worry. In two ways. We worry maybe about what everyone else might think if we did it overboard. They're just trying to gain attention. They're just trying to do this. Maybe we worry what people will think, or maybe we worry about what everyone else will do. We're too worried about what everyone else will do that we can't even focus on God ourselves. Too worried. I'm too worried that if I really get worshiping that somebody's going to cut loose, and man, that's just going to delay the service even longer. For one, let me just tell you this, and so we can all just agree and just come to terms with it. If you really worship the way some of these people worship, then people will get upset. Somebody will. Maybe not someone that's here currently. Maybe there is someone here currently. Whatever the case may be. Maybe it's the church down the street. Maybe it's the people in this neighborhood. Whatever. Somebody will get upset if we worship God correctly. But the response to that, what we do with that, is to care more about what God thinks than what anyone else does. Give Him all the weight. I know I'm going to mess you all up. You just said pick the song out. Can we do, and I know we ain't done it in a while, Agnes Day? Okay. I know you can do it. I got faith in you. The point is that He is worthy. Alright? Don't pay attention to Stephen scrambling. Just listen to me. They'll get it taken care of, I promise. I know it's in G, I think. Anyways. The point is, God gets all the weight. Right? It would be, let me paint you a picture real quick. You ready? Let me paint you a picture. What if we were all here right now? And while we're talking about worship, some drunken sinner walks in the back door. He cares not about what I have to say. He cares nothing about me stopping him. He cares nothing about what you think of him. But he runs to the middle, down here in front, not caring if anyone sees him or smells him. But he drops to his knees. And he comes as he is. And he gives all the weight to God. See, I think we know so much about worship that we've forgotten how to worship. That we have forgotten how to lower ourselves so low that we care what no one thinks. Someone that has nothing, who has nowhere to go, who has no friends, cares not one thing about what anybody thinks. But we have too many opinions to please. And I pray for a generation of people that says, I will give God all my weight because He is worthy of it.